Well, hey there, I'm Jay. Welcome to my booth. Compression is one of those things that is difficult for a lot of voiceover artists to wrap their heads around completely, challenging to know what exactly you're doing and what you're even going for. It can be hard to hear, especially at the beginning of your career. But it's also very important as a concept to have at least somewhat of a grasp on so that you can make your recordings sound a little bit more engaging, energetic, and ultimately just a smidge more professional at the end of the day. So in this video, I'm going to talk to you about what compression is, what different compressors look like and how to use them, and then ultimately what sort of sound we're going for when we compress our audio. So what is a compressor? In audio and in just sound in general, there's this thing called dynamic range, which essentially is the difference between the quiet bits of your audio and the loudest bits of your audio. And that difference is the range in the dynamics of your recording. And what a compressor does is it takes the loud bits and brings them closer or reduces the dynamic range between the loud bits and the quieter bits of your audio. One way to think about it is if you've ever been watching a film or TV show and it sounds great, the levels are pleasant to your ear, and then all of a sudden a swelling bit of music comes on screen, or say a commercial comes on between a commercial break happens while you're watching a TV show, and all of a sudden it's so loud and overpowering, you have to turn the volume down, and then a dialogue scene comes back or the commercials end and you're back in your TV show, and now it's too quiet and you have to turn the dial back up to get back to a good level. That sort of jockeying of the volume dial is more or less what we're doing with the compressor, or what we're trying to eliminate with a compressor in our own audio, so that the level is consistent across the TV show and the commercial sections of whatever we're looking at. Another way I like to think about compressors is sort of the rolling pins of the effects toolkit that we're using. So if we take a look here at this audio in my DAW, it's lumpy, like a piece of raw dough. There's lots of peaks, lots of valleys, and the differences between them, it's just really lumpy audio, and it's not a very smooth ride in terms of the dynamics of this audio. So I take my rolling pin, my compressor, and we can apply however much pressure we want, and we can just make it a smooth, even sheet of cookie dough or something like that. That's very pleasant and appealing for our listener. So that's what a compressor is. Now, there are lots of different types of compressors that all do more or less the same thing with a lot of the same concepts, but they just do it in slightly different ways that gives you different degrees of control or nuance on different aspects of what you want to compress. And they range from really simple, like these ones that just have a couple knobs or dials that you can turn, to kind of complex, like this one here that looks kind of complex, this one here that does a lot of stuff. But they all have sort of the same tools or principles behind them. So to go over that, I'm going to use this one specifically because for me, it just helps me to visualize what the heck's going on in terms of the audio. And it was helpful for me in terms of learning how to use a compressor. So the different things that they'll all have in some variation is a threshold, which is the point where we set the compressor to turn on. Then there's the ratio, which is how hard we want to compress or how heavily we press down with our rolling pin. There's the attack, which is how quickly the compressor turns on after the volume passes our threshold. So in this case, after the volume gets louder than minus 13 dB, it will turn on 5 milliseconds after passing that threshold of sound. On the other side of things, there's the release, which is how quickly the compressor turns off after the audio goes back below our threshold. In this case, 50 milliseconds after the audio gets quieter once again than 13 dB, minus 13 dB, it will turn off, the compressor will. And then finally, there's the makeup gain, because after we set our threshold, all of the loud bits above that are going to be made essentially quieter as they're pulled down closer to whatever threshold we've set. All in all, making our recording quieter as a whole. So most compressors will have this makeup gain stage where it boosts the volume of the whole recording overall back to roughly the level it was before it was compressed. So the overall volume doesn't really change as much, but everything sounds similar in volume. So really quickly before I break down how we're going to set each of these, or how we'll decide how to set each of these, let me just apply this compressor to this waveform we've got here and just watch what happens. Pay particular attention to the peaks in the audio, the loud portions, and watch how they change relative to the rest of the recording. Let's give it a shot. Ta-da! So you'll notice everything that was really loud is now not quite as extreme in its variations of volume or dynamics, which is more or less what we're doing with the compressor. Now let's get into how we can set our different parameters so that it does what we want it to do. We'll start with the threshold, because that's ultimately what dictates how everything else is going to work off of. Now, the way we determine where to set the threshold can vary from compressor to compressor, and how heavily you want the audio to be compressed. And as a quick little caveat, this audio here is pretty extreme. It's not, most things that you record likely won't look like this. But to set our threshold, we'll take a look at the waveform or the audio that we've recorded and kind of see where everything's averaging out in terms of its peak volume, where most of the loudest bits are, and that's most of the loudest bits, because there's this one here that clips, essentially. Where does everything live most of the time? And I'd say it's living around, just beyond minus 15 dB. So we'll set our threshold about 2 to 3 dB lower than where our average is. So I'll set this to about, minus 18, just to get a really prominent effect with this recording. Next is the ratio, and everything is any given number to 1. And what that ratio means is every 1 decibel above our threshold, in this case, minus 18 dB, for every 1 decibel louder than minus 18 dB, it'll pull it down by whatever number we set our ratio to. So let's try setting that to, 4 to 1, thereabouts. That means for every 1 decibel above the threshold, it's going to turn down the volume on that increase by 4 decibels until it hits the threshold. So if something is minus 16 dB, it's going to turn that down by 8, etc., etc. So a good ratio for most voiceover recordings is going to be a 2 to 1 to, on the heavier side, maybe a 4.5, 5 to 1 ratio. So in most cases, I'll split the difference and go to like 3, and that's a good general way to go. Now, in this recording, because there is such an extreme dynamic range, I may have to turn it up or do 2 compressors to sort of split the load. We'll do that at another time. Next is the attack, and this is how quickly the compressor turns on. Essentially, a slower attack, you're going to be compressing less quickly, and a faster attack is going to come in really sharply. And for most voiceover, you can be pretty quick at about 3 milliseconds to 5 milliseconds is where I generally find setting it. This is a setting that you don't really need to mess around with very much. And similarly, the release. A 50 millisecond release is perfectly respectable, and you can just tweak it to see if it sounds unnatural. Most of the time with compression, we want it to sound like we haven't compressed rather than changing the way everything sounds, more or less. The makeup gain, this compressor has an automatic makeup gain setting. But if your compressor doesn't, and I'll show you an example of this in a moment, what you can do is see sort of where the audio is in terms of its loudness level generally. Or Pooh for short, was walking through the forest one day. In playing it, we're hitting around, minus 9 dB. So after I've compressed, I'll just turn the gain back up on the whole recording until it's about the same level as it was before I compressed. For this one, we'll just leave the makeup gain automatically taking care of itself so that we don't have to worry about it. So we've set everything. Let's go ahead and apply it and see what happens. Great. So it's not a super flat recording just yet, which is totally fine because this recording had such an extreme dynamic range that if we really, really compressed it, it would ultimately change it a little bit more than maybe we'd want to. And again, this is a badly performed recording in terms of the dynamic range. But let's give it a listen and see how it sounds. Edward Bear, known to his friends as Winnie the Pooh, or Pooh for short, was walking through the forest one day, humming proudly to himself. So that's a good example there, because I am sort of loud, and then it gets quiet in the first section here, and then it gets quiet, but the volume of them is more or less the same, which is great. So let's take a look at another compressor that's maybe a little bit simpler to use in that it's only got 2 dials, which is fantastic. So on this one, the way that you work with these is this little meter here shows you how much it's being compressed by. So if I play this, Edward Bear, known to his friends as Winnie the Pooh, or you'll notice that the needle here is hovering at 0, meaning it's not compressing this audio at all. So to reduce the peaks, I just turn this up until I start to see that dial move. And again, we want it to be compressing most of the time between -1 to -3 dB on average. Any more than that, and you're getting into pretty heavy compression, which is not going to sound as good as you want it to. So let's give it a shot, and I'll just turn up this peak reduction until I start to see this needle hitting in this range. Let's give it a go. Edward Bear, known to his friends as Winnie the Pooh, or Pooh for short, was walking through the forest one day, humming proudly to himself. He had made up a little hum that very morning, as he was doing his stoutness. Great. So that is hitting more or less where we want it to hit. And so this knob here is our makeup gain knob, meaning we can turn everything back up after we've compressed it just now. So what I'll do to determine how much we should turn it up, again, I'll turn this whole compressor off and play to see where we're hitting our levels mostly. Pooh, or Pooh for short, was walking through the forest one day, humming proudly to. So it looks like we're hitting around -12 to -6 most of the time. So I'll turn my compressor back on now that I know that we've hit the good compression level. Go back to the beginning, and I'm just going to turn this gain knob up gently and look at this meter down here until I hit between -12 and -6 once again. Edward Bear, known to his friends as Winnie the Pooh, or Pooh for short, was walking through the forest one day, humming proudly to himself. He had made up a little hum that. All right, that looks pretty good to me. So we've dialed this one in, and these are very simple to use compressors and generally sound really good. So if the other one is throwing you for a loop, this is a good way to go. Just dialing into -1 to -3 and then pumping up the gain until you're hitting the levels that you want. Let's take a look at one more compressor just to give us one last example here. This one's really simple and is kind of like a bridge between the first one and the second one that I showed you in terms of how many different knobs and dials there are on it. But in taking a look, the first thing we'll do is, again, set the threshold. And from before, we know that's roughly around, 18 is where we decided it was in terms of looking at where most of the peaks are landing. Next, we'll set the ratio. Let's try 4:1. That might be a good place to go. And we'll just play it, and we'll watch this meter here, because that'll show us how much gain reduction is going on. Edward Bear, known to his friends as Winnie the Pooh, or Pooh for short, was walking through the forest one day. So that looks pretty good. On average, during these sort of medium loud bits, it looks like we're taking off roughly 3 to 4 dB in this meter reduction, which is a pretty good place to be living. As far as the attack and release, I'm just going to leave them at 10 milliseconds and 100 milliseconds because that's also a fairly good number. If I play it back after applying this compressor and it sounds a little funky or odd or inhuman, I may dial those, tweak them trial and error wise to see if something sounds a little bit better. I'm not going to touch the output gain in this instance just to let us see how much the volume goes down, and then we can deal with it after we've compressed, which is usually how I do it instead of doing it within the compressor, as it just leaves me a little bit more flexibility after the fact, which is a personal preference, but take it what you will. So let's apply it and see what happens. Great. So that is a much smoother look to the waveform than the others that we've seen before. So if we play it, Edward Bear, known to his friends as Winnie the Pooh, or Pooh for short, was walking through the forest. It's very consistent in terms of volume, but as you'll notice, it's not at the level that we want. Our peaks are a little shy, and for most auditions that you want to submit, you want everything to be with peak values at either -1 dB or -3 dB. My personal preference is -3 dB. So we're going to normalize this whole thing to -3 dB. There are a couple different ways to do that in Adobe Audition. The first is to just take this dial here and turn everything up until you see that line, the peaks here, hitting -3 dB. Super easy to do, and you have great control over it with this dial. Another way you can do it is if you go up to the Favorites tab, it'll have normalized to -3 dB already set up there. And you can just click that or dial it into a hotkey, and it'll just take everything to where it is. And then we can play it. Edward Bear, known to his friends as Winnie the Pooh, or Pooh for short, was walking through the forest one day, humming proudly to himself. Great. So that's how we dial in a compressor in a couple of different ways with a couple different compressors. Now, what exactly are we looking for in terms of the sound? Well, if we open this compressor again and we just over compress, I pull this threshold way down, way further than it needs to be, and we click apply and I normalize it back, it's going to sound horrible. Edward Bear, known to his friends as Winnie the Pooh, or Pooh for short, was walking through the forest. You'll notice that the resonance in my room starts to pop up. The sound of everything is much more exaggerated. My breaths are large. The little mouth noises are really present. So you don't want to go overboard, and you want to be as gentle as you can with it. And a great way to dial in your ear to finding the right sweet spot for your voice, your situation, is maybe get a recording of something that you admire. It could be a commercial, could be a demo of someone who has a similar demographic to you on a casting website like Voices or Voice 123, and listen to their demo and do sort of an A/B trial and error to find what works best for you and your voice and what the settings might be in your situation. So I hope this was helpful for you. If you have any questions about this or anything else voiceover related, please feel free to drop me a line down below, reach out on my website. And if you'd like a one-on-one session to learn more about compression and I can guide you through your own setup, I have one-on-one coaching available on my website as well. So until the next one, be well and toodles.